Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plot Lines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we're going to be looking at a topic very important for our time at the moment and as well as for all times, because this has been with us since the beginning. We have been persecuted ever as Christ said we would be, and not just persecuted from those who should obviously hate us because they are servants of the devil, but also by those who should be for us. Now, I have the author of the book Persecuted from Within, Alec Torres. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Alec Torres is a former speechwriter for President Donald Trump and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, and is basically a big ghostwriter. He is the co-founder of Allograph, a strategic writing, communications, and design firm, and him and his wife and children hail from Texas. So, thank you for coming on the show. I'm really interested to talk about this topic with you. So first, what is it like writing a book with a co-author? Because Joshua Charles also wrote this book with you. So first, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I really do appreciate you having me on the show here, especially to talk about Persecuted from Within. This has been a project for a couple of years now, really ever since Josh worked with me in the White House. We worked together there. So, uh, it's been a project almost since we left, honestly, and to finally see it come to fruition, to really look at the saints and how they, how their times can teach us about our own is really valuable to me. And I think it'll be valuable for a lot of readers. In terms of writing with a co-author, it had some hiccups, but also a lot of great parts to it. The hiccups were often, frankly, technological. He lives in California. I live in Texas. We used to live in DC. We're talking across time zones and trying to share documents, and our publishers on the East Coast. So there's a lot to deal with there. But more fundamentally, it was phenomenal to work with Josh because he's a true historian and he's a theologian as well. So the genesis of the book really, I just had the idea pop into my head one day. I thought to myself, how are we supposed to deal with it when leaders in our own church are abusive or wrong or heretical or scandalous or any number of things in a truly Christian Catholic way? I didn't know how to answer that. So I thought, well, I'll ask the people who do know how to answer that. And that's the saints. They can answer almost any question because they've lived these questions out in different ways in their own times. And then I thought, well, this is a really scary thing. How am I supposed to write miniature biographies of 8, 10, 12, however many people it ended up being by myself? I have a job, I have a family, and I have all these things to deal with. And a friend of mine said, I know exactly who you should work with. His name's Josh Charles. You already know him because you worked with him before. And I kind of kicked myself thinking, absolutely, that makes a heck of a lot of sense. So Josh jumped on the idea. He thought he thought it was a worthwhile subject as well. I really didn't have to sell him on it at all, and we hit the ground running.
And this idea didn't come while working in the White House, or was it after?
It was afterwards. I have to admit, working in the White House is one of those all-encompassing jobs. It's almost impossible to do or think about anything else. I mean, I was praise the Lord, there was a tabernacle within a 5-minute walk of the White House because it was pretty much work and daily mass and eating and sleeping, and that was my life. The kiddos didn't come until later, so
Okay.
thank goodness I wasn't being an absent father at that point. So afterwards, I had a lot more time to start thinking about the issues facing the church and to bounce things around in my head. But I don't want to seem too proud, but it was almost like an intervention of the Holy Spirit because I don't write on religious topics normally. I've written on history, but I'm a convert. I converted in 2014, and all of a sudden, boom, it hit me, and I thought, wait a second, this seems like it could work. This seems actually like it would be helpful for me personally, and if it's helpful for me, then who knows? Maybe there's a lot of other people in my shoes.
Was your career related to your conversion at all?
I, I wouldn't say so. It was related insofar as human beings are intertwined wholes, and really you can't separate anything out from the others. But the career manifested itself after the conversion. The seeds of my conversion were really sown in college, and they developed in my early career. And I converted before I became a speechwriter. Actually, now that I think about it, the day of my conversion on the Easter Vigil in 2014 was the first weekend after I became a speechwriter for Kevin McCarthy. So maybe the Lord just wanted to put a hedge of protection around me before I got thrown into Washington, D.C. Where sin abounds, grace abounds. So he wanted to make sure I was well protected before I got involved.
Indeed, sort of Babylon to be sent to.
Yeah.
So I mean, we look at our experience, or sort of the times when our members of our hierarchy and those that are supposed to be leading us are persecuting us or have been doing evil things. And then we look back in history, as you said, you're familiar with, you wrote a lot of history prior, or you had experience with it, and sort of now you're doing that, but sort of in a with saints, as well as you start off with our Lord Jesus as he was persecuted um, by the Pharisees. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the difference you see in writing like sort of this kind of history versus other types of histories that you've written for?
Yeah, the I guess my experience with history before was really trying to extract stories or inspiration that could be infused into conversations in our times much more directly and explicitly, because it was done in a political context almost my entire career. This one was different because Josh and I, we do draw analysis. Absolutely. We try to pull out and tease out lessons, and we lean on fathers of the church and St. Thomas and try to really explore what the lives of the saints are teaching. But within the chapters on the saints, it really is a lot of hard, in-depth history. It reminded me a lot, frankly, of being in college. We were dealing with primary sources. We were dealing with translations. We were verifying if things were correct. I mean, if there's one thing you can find, it's that quotes from saints are like quotes from the founding fathers online. You actually don't know if they're correct unless you really verify it, because there's a lot of false information about there. And we wanted to make sure that everything that we presented to people was an accurate description of the saints and their lives and what they said and what they did. So it was an intensive project. The book isn't robustly long. It's a decent sized book for sure. But each individual chapter, I mean, there's been tomes written about each of these saints, and we condensed it. And that just took a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of reading through these materials. But we hope in a very fruitful way, because we try not to get bogged down in secondary issues to not that they aren't important, but that they aren't important to what issue we're trying to explore in this book in particular.
Yeah, your end notes are definitely substantial.
And
For what
those
you
are cut down. I would add too. We tried to when a book was referenced multiple times, we tried to say, just look at that book. We don't need to give you every page number every time.
Yeah, I mean, and so it's not sort of an academic book, so it's not as important to have it documented that intensively. But you really, it's important that you start with our Lord and his persecution, and the fact that the book is called Persecuted from Within. I don't think a lot of people think about Jesus as being persecuted from within, but more from without.
It is a misconception, but one has to remember that Jesus was the perfect Jew. He was the only one who ever fulfilled the law fully and completely. And in his preaching too, he said to obey the leaders, the Jewish leaders. It wasn't until he fulfilled and superseded the law that and the early church kind of negotiated. We read about in the Acts and in all the epistles from Jude and from John and from Paul, that we start to negotiate what that means to move beyond these cultural prescriptions of the law. But for Jesus, he really did follow his leadership, and he submitted to them. So no, he was within the system. He didn't come in and say, I'm going to break apart Judaism. He came in to live within and fulfill Judaism, which meant within the structure that God created, that the Trinity created Judaism to be through its history.
If I'm not mistaken, the Jews also had sort of the chair of Moses. They had the authority that basically would be passed on to Saint Peter himself.
That's 100% correct. I mean, it's one of those fascinating, I won't even call it echoes, just continuities that God has in his divine plan through history. It's beyond the scope of the book, but so many times we see aspects of Judaism manifesting themselves within the church in a fuller and more complete way, including in that power of the chair of Moses with the chair of Peter transferring from Jerusalem over to Rome. So no, the Jewish authorities that Jesus was under, they had power. Absolutely. We can see that in how they exercised it, but they had legitimate power too, legitimated by the fact that God gave it to them, which is a mystery in itself, since we all know the story. They used that power that they legitimately had illegitimately to kill Jesus. So that is, I mean, there's a reason we started with Jesus. That's at the core of it. Somebody has legitimate power. They use that power improperly, illegitimately, wrongly to do evil, including the gravest evil that was ever done in the history of the world. How are we supposed to reconcile those two things? Jesus was the one who exemplified that.
Indeed. Now, there's a phrase you mentioned in the book, false meekness and false obedience. What do you mean by that?
I think there are errors that people can have when approaching sin, scandal, heresy, wrongdoing from church leaders, and those errors run the gamut. We can see it in we can see it in Protestantism, for one, what that says: there are errors and sin in the clergy, so therefore let's throw them off and create our own church. And that's never been accepted. It wasn't accepted in the Old Testament. It's certainly never been the case in the times after Christ's death and resurrection. So that's one, and Catholics implicitly understand that, whether we know the reasons why or not. We're like, that's not okay. Well, there's still other ways that you can operate in error. One is to simply say, well, they are our superiors, so therefore we have to obey them. In a way, yes, that's true. Obedience is a Catholic moral teaching. It's at the foundation of our faith. Jesus was perfectly obedient to the Father, and he said that we must be perfectly obedient as well. But that word perfect really matters, because if you're going to be obedient to God, sometimes that means you can't be obedient to his ministers on earth if they are doing or preaching things contrary to what God commands us to do. This is a massive subject. It's one we do cover in the book and we can discuss further. But the point is that we do have to distinguish, just because a bishop or a priest or even the Pope says something or even commands something, doesn't necessarily mean that we are obligated to follow it. We needed to give due deference to it. We have to weigh those circumstances very, very prudentially and rationally and in good faith. But there is a higher law, which is God. So that's kind of the false meekness, where you can say, well, let's just take the easy way out. One, the easy way out is let's just throw off the clergy. Okay, well, we don't do that. The other easy way out is, well, let's just literally always follow the clergy, whatever they command. That also is not the way that it works. And that false meekness is really what we mean by a false obedience.
Gotcha. Could you sort of explain a little bit more about sort of the hierarchy of the Jewish leaders at the time of Jesus, so we can sort of maybe sort of examine and compare maybe to what we would think of modern day?
Yeah, it is. There are echoes without it being perfect per se, because it did operate differently, but they did have a high priest, who can be equated with the Pope in many regards, who sat as the ruler over a Sanhedrin, which can be seen as a college of cardinals of sort around him, as a group of advisors and fellow leaders of a lower role, but still very high within the Jewish community, followed by those rabbis who would be around within their communities, operating as the priests within our own community. And you know, it is debatable, and there's many aspects to it. How it's not a perfect match per se, but that was all there. And any good Jew would know that you're supposed to have proper deference to your rabbis, to the Sanhedrin, and of course to the high priest who did, once a year, directly go into the Holy of Holies, into the presence of God. Um, so Jesus was, he was, in terms of that hierarchy, in many ways rather low on it. I want to say that in his human terms. Obviously, as God, he was above all of it and he created it. But as a man, he placed himself in a position beneath that hierarchy, beneath people who were demonstrably worse than him, and demonstrably worse than even just other people. So there are Jesus's lessons definitely apply today. If there were imperfect high priests then, and imperfect Sanhedrins then, we can have imperfect popes and imperfect cardinals now.
How did he work within this system? How especially, I mean, he submitted himself to the Sanhedrin, but sort of in what ways did they like, how can you explain sort of there's the story of how they turned against him, or did they, you could argue that they never accepted him to begin with.
Well, it's a more complicated story. As most everyone knows, there were some that most, many, if not most, were against Jesus. Maybe they tried to give him a hearing, maybe not. I mean, Jesus speaks very directly and very harshly, it can seem to us, to them. Mostly in an effort to try and get through to them, because they were so hostile. But there were some who were on Jesus's side, oftentimes in secret. Obviously, we know of Nicodemus, who was on Jesus's side. But I mean, it really did seem like, a plain reading of the gospel would show that they were hostile to him from the very beginning, because of his disruption of their norms, not the laws, but the norms that they decided to elevate to the highest degree, the load that they put upon other people that they refused to carry themselves, as I'm paraphrasing Jesus. And we can see within their minds that they were conceiving of their leadership within the Jewish community as one of power. Right. Even in their condemnation of Jesus, it is better for one man to die, as the high priest said prophetically, than for many. Well, he meant that as it's better for Jesus to die than for us to get in trouble with the Romans. They're worried about this negotiation with the civil authorities, and it's a strange echo that we can have today, where one doesn't want to be uncharitable, but it's hard not to view many of our senior leaders within the church, bishops and cardinals included, as being more like civil heads, or heads of religious themed NGOs, trying to make it work within the world and please civil authorities, than as pastors of the church who care for the souls of their flocks. You can't speak to their heart. I don't know their hearts, but oftentimes you just see it in the way that they speak and they operate. Sometimes you hear a bishop and you're like, yes, you care. You just, from the words that come out of your mouth, I can tell you care for the souls of your people. And other times you're thinking, is this, every word that comes from your mouth seems like it came produced from a bureaucracy. Like, why does it sound like this? it's a mirror of the civil authorities at the time, and of many times the heirs of the civil authorities of our times. And that was the case in Jesus's time too. And he was trying to knock them out of that, to be like, this, your job is to care for these people's souls, for them to attain union with the Father. And they couldn't, in the end, so many of them seemed to not be able to break out of that political mindset that they were in.
Indeed. It does seem often like bishops these days are sort of negotiating with the world on how Catholic they can be, or how Catholic we're allowed to be.
Yeah, they have a tough job. I mean, I pray for my bishop, my metropolitan, and the Pope every single day, because it is not easy to negotiate that, especially in a world that's becoming increasingly hostile to Christianity and Catholicism in particular. So in one sense, yes, they have to deal with the world all the time, and they have to negotiate that. But it's a problem of hierarchy, of order, in many times, that one can never put good relations with the world, however one much should strive. Well, not with the world, but with authorities within the world. There's no point in poking people in the eye and disrupting things without a purpose. Jesus disrupted things with a great purpose. Otherwise, he would try to be, he wanted to meet people where they are and love them. So there's no problems with that. But sometimes it feels like that can become elevated, where it's, are you trying to be popular in Washington, D.C., or are you trying to preach the truth of the gospel? Because I really can't tell. Or sometimes I can tell, and I wish that I couldn't.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, thank you for reminding me to pray for my metropolitan. I feel like that one is something many, including myself, forget.
Yeah, I don't know how I got clued into that one at one time. I think a good priest just told me, your metropolitan really needs it too. And before, I lived in DC, so it was kind of one and the same. And when I moved to Texas, outside, I'm in the Diocese of Fort Worth now. I was reminded that my bishop is seen as of lesser importance than the bishop next door, who himself is under another bishop who is the metropolitan. So I was like, okay, now I really feel the hierarchy here. I got to get all the layers.
Indeed. Yeah. No, I just really appreciate that. I hadn't thought about that. Now, you go through a bunch of different stories of saints and the way that they were persecuted internally and externally in some capacity. Now, there are a lot of ones that you go through that are very well known, but I want to sort of guide people to less known saints. So the first sort of more or less unknown saint you talk about in the book is Saint Bruno. Can you sort of give us a little bit of background about Saint Bruno and what his story was like?
Yeah, Bruno's an incredible saint, honestly. I have to admit, I did not know about him before writing this book. When we were collecting ideas and generating ideas for whom to write about, some of them stood out. You're like, oh, well, Padre Pio, of course, or you have St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila. They obviously faced big issues. But then St. Bruno, somebody brought him up, and I'm like, I don't actually know much about him at all. I really had to look into it. And his, man, if you think we live in some troublesome times, you got to look at St. Bruno's time. He was in the 11th century, and it was in a time that was called the pornocracy, when the Vatican and Rome was effectively even run by prostitutes who were consorting with the clergy. I mean, it was, gosh, morally, it was just so corrupt. And it was also a time in which there was a big breakdown within civil and ecclesial authority were fighting with each other, back and forth. There wasn't as much control over any situation, so things just felt chaotic. And just as a sign of the chaos, at certain times troops would invade Italy, and would threaten the Pope by force of arms. And then the Pope's allies, the Normans, would sweep into the city and kick them out. And then the Romans would revolt against having the Normans come in, and they would kill the Normans and throw them out. And all the while, the Pope's getting thrown back and forth. Sometimes he'd have to flee, and sometimes he'd come back in. Sometimes he'd be hiding out in Castel Sant'Angelo. Sometimes he'd be at the Vatican. I mean, holy moly, was it chaotic. But back to St. Bruno, he was a figure who, in many ways, his sacrifice seems less than others. He didn't lose his life. He wasn't excommunicated or anything like that. However, because the story of his life was one of such great success, the thought of losing that success could almost be more terrifying. Almost like for modern Western Catholics, martyrdom seems so distant, and maybe we could say to ourselves naively, oh, I would be a martyr, of course. But then if somebody says, well, would you, lose out on the respect of your neighbors or sacrifice a promotion at work? And it comes down to it practically, we're like, that one's a little hard. I don't know. I was really planning on getting a new car. So those lesser sacrifices can seem more because of the situation we're in. So St. Bruno, he was elevated to the highest levels of the church. He was an advisor to, if I'm remembering correctly, 3 different popes. I mean, he was at the center of the action for decade after decade after decade, participating in the curia that would choose the next pope, advising the pope on almost every matter, traveling with the pope right there in the middle of it. The controversy that was really at the center of St. Bruno's life, or at least within this book, was the division between lay authority, civil authority, and ecclesial authority. I know I'm going on long with him, but he really is a fascinating figure. The story of it is that the emperor at the time said that he had the authority to appoint bishops within his jurisdiction, and that the Pope really didn't have a right to get involved. And St. Bruno confronted this problem with the very theoretically obvious fact that the church is higher than the civil, that in the order of goods, the civil has a legitimate authority, but the church is higher than it because it has spiritual authority, and God is obviously then the highest of all of that. So, there can be negotiations between it. Civil authorities can have a place within the process, but they simply can't cut the church out. They can't cut the hierarchy out. They don't have that right. So he advised the Pope on this. There was lots of back and forth. But at one point, the Pope was imprisoned by the emperor and put under duress. And the emperor essentially said, you are going to crown me in Rome as emperor, and you are going to say that I have the right to name bishops, or else you're staying in prison until the end of your days. And the Pope, under duress, signed an agreement to do that. So St. Bruno was in this situation where the Pope, whom he served, signed an agreement to do something that he thought was not just wrong, but that allowed for something heretical to happen, allowed for something that was not condoned by God to happen. Not that the Pope was heretical, but that he was allowing for something heretical to happen. And he stood up against it. He wrote a letter. He made abundantly clear that he was the servant of the Pope, that he still was at the service of the Pope, that he was not disobeying the Pope, but simply that decision was wrong. And as a price for that, he was kicked out from the heights of power. Ultimately, it didn't even matter to him too much because he wanted to be a monk more than anything else. But even that was taken away from him. They said, no, you can't go back to be a monk at Monte Cassino. You have, so you don't get to be a monk and you don't get to be in power. You're just kicked to the side. And he had to sacrifice that in order to stand for the truth. But to his great credit, ultimately the church came back to his side and years later said that his position was 100% correct. And we are going to definitively say that no, the ecclesial is higher than the civil. And he was justified in the end, but it did come at quite a high career cost for him.
Interesting. And given sort of our time we live in, I think it's pretty hard for us to imagine even the debate between what's sovereign, sort of spiritual or sort of temporal power, because the temporal power has obviously won out.
Yeah, in many ways, the temporal powers won out, but also at the same time, it's because the temporal powers ignore the ecclesial powers so much. They don't put much weight upon it. There's almost less meddling in many ways before. Now we can see meddling for sure, and China is a great example of this, and it happens all over the world. But in the West, in America, a president wouldn't think to intervene in the choosing of a bishop within America, not because he doesn't think he might not think he has the power. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But probably because he just doesn't think it's that important, you know?
Mm.
And I think that's the case in a lot of the Western world today. But the
Well,
principle still stands, even if people don't, even if practically people don't see the church as having greater authority than civil government.
indeed, in a way, the church won, but also the sort of the argument has become less important. But I mean, even if even if a president did have something to do with, um, say a certain bishop coming to power, I feel like it wouldn't be public and we wouldn't know about it anyways.
Yeah, that's probably the case. And who knows what times will bring? There's kind of a lot of chaos today, and we are in a rather unique time. There is one additional note here with Saint Bruno that I do think is important, if only because it's popped up in the news and seems to be a recurring error. There was I want to say it was a couple weeks ago, a Jesuit had asked Pope Francis what he thought about American bishops and American Catholics criticizing him. And it wasn't, the question wasn't undermining his authority or saying he's a heretic or anything, but it was just criticizing him. That whole conversation aside, it is a strange open question now, as Saint Bruno showed, that there's a lot of room. He is a saint to criticize the Pope. And the decisions and actions that a pope makes, and that can be justified if the stakes are high enough and if it really matters. So Saint Bruno obviously believed it mattered. The church clarified later that it believed it mattered too, but it did show that even the pope is not above reproach in many regards.
St. Paul also proved that.
100%, and he's covered in our book too. It's another fascinating chapter in my mind.
Yes, it really. I mean, the amount of saints you go through is very impressive, and their stories need to be understood by more people. So I appreciate that. If I haven't said it already, there'll be a link in the description for people to go buy this book. Hopefully, you buy it from Sophia Institute because we want to support our Catholic publishers and not just Amazon. That would be preferable, is to avoid giving your money to Amazon if you can give your money to a Catholic publisher instead.
Yeah, and I'll add to it too. I know the 2-day shipping can seem really exciting sometimes, and I hope people are just itching to read the book. But it doesn't come out till October 17th, and the stories of these saints aren't going anywhere. And unfortunately, it seems like confusing times aren't either. So if you have to wait a little longer, please do order it from Sophia Institute Press, because I agree, we got to support our Catholic publishing houses here.
The next saint I want to talk about is Saint Mary MacKillop. Am I pronouncing that right?
I believe
MacKillop.
it's McKillop.
McKillop.
Yeah, she's Scottish in root, and it's usually it's Mac is how it goes. McKillop.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We'll
but
just
yeah,
call her Saint Mary, as long as people know it's not our Holy Mother.
Okay, that sounds good. So Saint Mary is an Australian saint. Is she the first Australian saint, or
She was the first canonized saint from Australia. Yep.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about her?
Yeah, she So Australia obviously is not a Catholic country. It's a relatively small percentage of the population, was then and is now. She was in the 19th century, and and she just had a heart of gold. So she came from a poor family who Australia was almost like America in many ways for the British Empire. Like people just moved there hoping that they could get a better life out of this new and wild land.
It was
So
a
she,
prison colony originally.
yeah, and it was. I mean, well, let's just say I live in Texas now, and I tell people it's like Texas is like the Australia of America. You go outside, and it seems like everything's trying to kill you, whether it's the heat or the scorpions or the snakes or you name it. So Australia is not a very forgiving place to move to. Um, but it kind of shows you their level of desperation. It was a very rudimentary colonial place. Her father was in seminary to be a priest and dropped out, and that sort of always weighed on Saint Mary. And he just had struggles with money and made bad investments and bad decisions, so they were always kind of eking out a living. Um, but she had a heart for children, absolutely loved children, and she wanted to teach children. Um, but there was a tiered system in Australia, so she wanted to teach the poor children who couldn't afford the school fees. Um, so she at first just founded schools doing this, and eventually felt that she was called to actually found a new religious order. They got affectionately called the Brown Joeys because of their brown habits that they wore. But it was very, very simple. They wanted to have young women, or not young women, but women, to vow poverty and have a charism for teaching children. That was it. Well, you'd think that this would be uncontroversial, right? I mean, what kind of bishop, what kind of community doesn't want nuns sacrificing their lives at pittance wages, subsistence, in order to teach children who would otherwise have no education? It seems like a no-brainer. But for some reason, it doesn't matter if it's a no-brainer or not. The world and the devil always seem to try and get in the way and turn these things over. So Saint Mary faced a lot of controversy and problems, mostly because she wanted her order to be able to run itself quasi independently. Not necessarily not independently of the jurisdiction of the Pope or of Rome or anything like that, but to operate without the bishops being directly involved in the day-to-day affairs. Now, this wasn't a snub against the bishops. This was simply a management difficulty. If they were in Brisbane and they needed to have more nuns in Sydney, she wanted to be able to send nuns over to Sydney to be able to work there without having to have approval from the bishop to transfer from one to another, to have them under different jurisdictions and to do that paperwork. And, it was a good faith thing that she wanted. And if you read the book, you'll see that there's actually a lot of good reasons she wanted that. Practically speaking, it really was quite important. Now, the bishops and their advisors had a lot of problems with the way that she wanted to run her order. Part of it was in terms of they thought it was an affront to their authority, that she didn't want to be directly under the bishop in each and every one of their decisions. And part of it did have some racial, ethnic connotations. She was Scottish. Without getting into too many details, there were accusations of some of her nuns against Irish priests, who were then eventually sent back from Australia back to Ireland. Most of the priests in Australia at the time were Irish, kind of like America in the 19th century too. And the Irish leadership felt antipathy at having some of their fellow priests contradicted in this regard by her nuns.
Sounds
So
like
there
the
was,
Irish of the time.
yeah, there was a lot of strife. We don't definitively say within the book who was right and who was wrong here, but at a certain point you do have to say, well, let's move beyond this, for the greater good of the church. And it seems like this ethnic factor was always kind of pushing decisions. Now Mary's case is particularly fascinating because she is a saint who was excommunicated, um, which seems like a contradiction. How can a saint be excommunicated? Uh, we saw this as well. Another saint in our book, Saint Joan of Arc, she was excommunicated, um, and it's worthwhile for people in our times because it demonstrates just how messy the world can be and how messy the church can be at times. And that messiness neither negates the authority of the church or the jurisdiction of the church or anything like that, nor does it negate the rightness of the cause of those who are caught up in the messiness. Um, so in St. Mary's occasion, essentially the story, it's hard to describe in a shorthand because it was ultimately based upon miscommunication.
Mm-hmm.
A bishop within Australia had told Mary that she was supposed to report to another house, and that she would be excommunicated. There would be uh, repercussions if she didn't. And Mary and the nuns, the message wasn't sent to Mary; it was sent to her fellow nuns. And the message they heard was Mary is excommunicated if she doesn't go there. And not just that, but that Mary is already excommunicated because she didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the game of telephone happened. Things didn't happen as the bishop wanted. Mary wasn't informed of exactly what was said anyway. So the bishop came in and said, okay, well, you and your nuns are excommunicated because you didn't follow my directions. So they issued an excommunication. Um, Mary went to plead her case, and the bishop was having none of it whatsoever. So she was sent away. No more the leader of her order, no more a nun, just a laywoman. Only to find out that all of this was based upon a miscommunication. Now, in many ways, bad faith miscommunication because there was already bad blood and strife going on. But still, she was declared excommunicated by her bishop. Um, she bore this with immense peace, and with truly godly charity. Um, she refused to speak against the bishop. She refused to contradict him publicly. In fact, her mother wrote, oh, I'm going to remember it incorrectly. It was either a letter to the editor or an op-ed or something like that. She published something in a paper to condemn the bishop's actions. And Mary was said to have said privately that her mother vindicated her. Her mother was right, but oh, at what a cost. Because she never wanted to contradict her bishop like that in public, at least over something that impacted just her and her fellow sisters. This wasn't a question of doctrine. It wasn't a question of morals. It wasn't a burden put upon the lay people. It was put upon her and those who put themselves in obedience to the church through becoming religious. So she bore it silently and with great faith. And ultimately, it was found that her excommunication was invalid, that the bishop was wrong, and through a long series of events, she was brought back in to be the leader of her order.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Also, like a lot of these saints or possible saints, because Fulton Sheen, we're gonna get to him soon, is a venerable at the moment. A lot of them just did not want to publicly uh, sort of criticize their superiors until they had to, or unless they had to.
Yeah,
And
and that had to is without realizing it when we wrote the book, that became the crux of it. And I won't reveal too much. You'll have to buy the book and read the whole thing. But that determination of when to be silent and when to speak up, I for me personally, that was the greatest lesson I learned from the saints. So hopefully folks will be willing to take a look and read through the stories and see how that bears out through their lives.
indeed. Also, I think Saint Mary, it was her family was a Jacobite family, right?
Yes, exactly.
So they had they held to their faith through a lot of political strife back in the United Kingdom, back in Great Britain.
Yeah, there's my priest now is actually a. Well, I guess I haven't asked him about the Jacobite roots, but he's Scottish as well, and finding a Scottish Catholic whose family was a Scottish Catholic through the years, that's a tough one right there. Those are some faithful people.
You'll have to ask your priest at some point, because I have a feeling Jacobite.
Yeah, I would be shocked if not.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of them just became Protestant because of uh, you know, a lot of other political stuff. But yeah, so Saint Mary, very interesting situation, and also just from us being or from Australia is such an odd thing to see. So it's a nice little story to have for Australians, any Australians dealing with such problems in their own dioceses.
And ironically for Saint Mary too, she was beloved by people of other religions, oftentimes because she'd be teaching their children, Jews, Protestants. So at the same time, her bishops, the bishops that she was under within Australia, were condemning her and attacking her and subverting her. Protestants and Jews loved her. So it's one of those great ironies.
And the simple reason for her excommunication was that she uh, didn't follow an order.
It was ultimately rooted in a miscommunication that the bishop gave an order that was not properly communicated to Saint Mary. Now, whether or not he had the authority to give that order is another question. But either way, Mary didn't know that she was supposed that there was this request upon her. So upon her not following the request that she didn't know about, the bishop excommunicated her, which means it was invalid. However, imagine being in her shoes where you're declared excommunicated. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's invalid or not. If you find out 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, that's quite a weight to bear if you're a faithful Catholic who wants to be submissive and properly obedient to the hierarchy of the church, to have the hierarchy declare you excommunicated. I don't
Again,
wish that upon anyone, even if they are vindicated in the end.
that sounds like a very difficult situation to be in, and yeah, I wouldn't wish anybody uh, to experience that. So let's move finally closer to home. Venerable Fulton Sheen. Now, Venerable Fulton Sheen had a life in which he experienced almost the height of popularity in the United States with his television show, and with his rise to prominence in the hierarchy. But he had these battles with the Cardinal Archbishop of New York throughout this. So can you talk a little bit about his story?
Yeah, Fulton Sheen is. I have a great love for him. I knew a little bit about his life before working on this book, but he really. I think what I love is that he is um, was such an honest man, and he wrote an autobiography where he acknowledged at the end of his own life his own faults, circumspectly in many regards. Yes, it wasn't like he was just laying lurid details out on the table, but he had the self possession and self knowledge to recognize that despite the fact that he was honored and praised and glorified, not just in America but throughout the entire world, um, that he wasn't perfect. And frankly, I think it would be hard for anybody to be told throughout your entire life how wonderful you are and how impressive you are and how intelligent you are and how wonderful you look on TV and everything like that, to keep humility. So he had a great amount of grace, demonstrable in his life. Um, his in an odd way was a situation like Saint Bruno, where he was at this height of power and got pushed away from it, because of his interactions with the hierarchy. Um, and his this is where I like that within the book we chose to go from Jesus to the, from the first century to the 20th century, from the Middle East to Europe to Australia to the Americas. We wanted to really get a very broad look, because you can see just how stupid, really, for lack of a better term, some of the reasons for persecution are. With St. Mary MacKillop, we saw that it was based on the miscommunication. For Venerable Fulton Sheen, the persecution he faced was ultimately rooted in milk money. So he received he and one of his positions was to dispense some of the immense charitable contributions of America throughout the whole world for the purposes of the church, to uplift the poor, to spread the gospel. And in this time, in the mid 20th century, that was no small amount of money. America and American Catholics were gaining in wealth and gaining in power at that time, and Europe was in a post-war environment. They were in shambles economically. So America just had a lot of economic clout in this time, and American Catholics especially. So this was no small role. Well, his Cardinal Archbishop, he gave Venerable Fulton Sheen milk, dried powdered milk to distribute, and he was given this free of charge from the U.S. government to distribute to the poor. Okay, sounds good enough. Government gives dried milk to the Archbishop Cardinal. The Cardinal gives it to Venerable Fulton Sheen. Fulton Sheen distributes it. Sounds easy. Well, the Cardinal demanded that Fulton Sheen pay him for the milk. And Fulton Sheen said, "You didn't pay for the milk. This is for the poor. I'm not paying you for the milk." And the Cardinal, it's hard to interpret his actions, and putting a charitable light on this is very difficult.
Yes.
He essentially said, "This is the first time anybody has ever dared to contradict me. I'm going to remember this. And even if it takes 10 years, I'm going to make sure that you pay for this over milk," And sorry, were you saying something?
Didn't the Cardinal also help pull him off the air?
Well, that's where this comes into play. I mean, you have this long-running feud that happens where all the power and authority that Fulton Sheen had got stripped away. Now, I will say, just to be completely fair, that some of this is based off of, I'm not going to say conjecture or hearsay, but on circumstantial evidence. Can I say definitively that the Cardinal did X, Y, and Z to destroy Bishop Fulton Sheen's life? No, I can't. However, most of those at the time who were familiar with the situation and the historians who wrote about this do agree that the Cardinal did intervene and follow up on his threat. Fulton Sheen was pulled from his position distributing these charitable funds. That was a major position for him. He no longer had that authority. He was pulled off the air. This can be seen as, well, okay, it's TV. Business changes. Nobody's guaranteed a spot on TV. Well, yes and no. His ratings were amazing. I mean, non-Catholics watched this show in droves. Catholics watched this show in droves. Millions of people were tuning in to watch a bishop in full Episcopal regalia in front of a chalkboard talk about morality and theology and virtue. I mean, it was astounding, frankly. It's not like this was a massive production value thing. He literally stood in front of a chalkboard and talked about why you need to be a good person. And, this would lead into the Catholic faith in many ways. He was pulled from the air. And the coup de grace came when he was sent away from New York City. He was in New York City, and he was known in this city. He had power in this city. He'd walk into a room and people recognized him. And he was sent to be the Bishop of Rochester in upstate New York. Now, there's nothing wrong with Rochester. Rochester is there's great Catholics there. I myself live in a small diocese now in Fort Worth, and we should have good bishops. I want good bishops. for small dioceses like that. But it was a place immensely ill-suited for Fulton Sheen's talents. He fit in where he was before. He knew how to work the media. He knew how to raise money. He was very, very good at this. Organizationally and bureaucratically running a diocese, that objectively he didn't do well. I mean, it was. There are several stories we cover in the book, but let's just say that you have a man who would be recognized the world over, whom the masses adored, at one point had a mob surrounding his car protesting him for decisions that he was making as an archbishop, I mean, as a bishop, and the ways that he was making those decisions. He had hundreds of his own priests in a diocese that had something like 600 priests, if I remember correctly, signing a letter against him, essentially a massive sign that they had no faith in his leadership. And he was sent there by his cardinal. So this is what's seen as his cardinal's revenge, to get him out of New York, out of TV, out of these positions of power, off into Rochester, which many saw as a backwater diocese that didn't suit his talents, where he essentially failed at his job and was gone within a few years. Submitted his resignation, and it's debatable. It was after Vatican II, so technically he was nearing the age of retirement, yes, but at the same time, it just wasn't working well. And when he returned to New York, it wasn't the same. He tried to get back on the air. They put him up on a TV show, and it lasted 13 episodes, and they canceled it. People weren't tuning in anymore. Some of the magic was lost. He didn't have his position anymore in raising money. You can't say he ended up in obscurity. I mean, he was still honored at the prayer breakfast and met presidents and stuff like that. But he really was never at the level that he was at before. And it's pretty clear that it was attributed to his cardinal executing a grudge on him.
Sorry, can you repeat that part?
Oh, I was just saying he never returned to the same level of prominence and of power that he had before after he was sent to Rochester, and it's pretty darn clear that it was because of what the cardinal because of the cardinal's intervention. Now I should say in all of this, one thing I didn't mention, like Saint Mary, Venerable Fulton Sheen never said a word against his cardinal. In fact, when he was sent off to Rochester, he had a press conference standing right next to the cardinal, smiling and waving to the cameras and thanking him for the position and everything like that. And his autobiography, he doesn't write a thing against the cardinal. In fact, he explicitly says that he was not going to write anything about the incident, no matter how much people wanted him to, because it hurt him. It's not like his cardinal was telling people, go and get divorced and receive communion, or there's no such thing as the Trinity. There's actually only one God, and it's Allah. He never did anything like that. So yeah. Fulton Sheen said, "I will submit," and he was quiet about it.
Yeah, he wasn't called to sin by his bishop. Now, from sort of moving it close to home, I feel like, I think the word exile is pretty apt for what happened to him. Exiled to Rochester. It makes me think, I'm not sure if the situation is exact, because we really don't know what's happening, but I think it could be said that Bishop Barron was exiled to his really small diocese in Minnesota from LA.
The moment it happened, we were finishing up the book, or we were in the editing process of the book when that happened, and that was my immediate thought. I don't know the details. Maybe we'll know more as time goes on, but I thought, okay, major diocese under an archbishop, massive media prominence. For Fulton Sheen, it was on TV. For Bishop Barron, it was online, the new media forum, and he's booted out to a small diocese that most Americans hadn't heard of or couldn't locate on a map. Well, the echoes seem to be there.
Yeah, the difference is, though, that Bishop Barron, his internet presence is not controlled by by the cardinal. So I think that, or at least it would have been harder to remove him probably from the
Yeah,
union.
and you've seen that there are examples of bishops and cardinals essentially telling those beneath them that they can't even speak publicly. And there are circumstances in which that's within their jurisdiction and authority, and circumstances where it's not. But it does seem like that is a very big difference. When Fulton Sheen left New York, he left the New York studio. He couldn't get another studio. It wasn't as easy to pull out a TV show, from New York live if you're in Rochester.
Exactly. Yeah. No, very very interesting stuff. All these saints and well, we got a venerable here as well. Have very interesting stories, and I think this is a very important book. And I really I appreciate you and Joshua Charles writing this book, because I think people need to know more about all of these different characters, and this guidance I think is very important for our time. So thank you for that. And sort of, is there anything upcoming other than the book that you'd like to share?
Well, no, this is kind of one of those strange things where I guess you can tell that there were good motives behind the book. At least I really hope that there were, and there's nothing tarnishing it. Um, I was very happily a ghostwriter before. I'm going to very happily be a ghostwriter afterwards. Um, I've learned to never. I told my wife I'd never write a book, and then here I am with a book. So I'm not going to say never, but I don't have a need for a show. I'm not going to become a commentator or anything like that. The reason I'm here with you, and I'm so thankful that you had me on, is just because we did write this book. And if it was my words there, I'd be less excited about trying to tell people that you have to read it, but all I did was look at the saints and study their lives, and I was blessed to be able to have the time and the ability to put that together and to write that in such a way that people can hopefully understand it and draw lessons for themselves. So I don't have anything else coming up, because hopefully people will want to look at this just because they want to know what the saints have to say to them. I know they sure as heck helped me.
Well, really, it's a great book. Please go out and get this book. Very important. If you love history, if you love Catholicism, even if you just love sort of the political dynamics of the situation, there's sort of plenty of that going on. Even if it's more in the background, most likely, because the focus really is on the saint's life, not necessarily political dynamics. But there's definitely elements of that in the book. So Alec, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure having you and talking with you, and I wish you great luck and Godspeed with
Thank you so much.
whatever you have left or whatever you're going to be doing in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll see what the Lord has in store for me, but I really appreciate it.
Thank you all for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and God bless.